A barefoot boy stood at the river's edge, laughing as silver fish splashed near his ankles. For the first time in months, there was life in the muddy waters of northern Burkina Faso. Behind him, hundreds of villagers cheered as trucks released massive tanks of fish into the river. It wasn't a festival. It wasn't aid from the UN. It was a presidential operation, a bold decision made by one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. While most world leaders give speeches in suits behind bulletproof glass, Traoré was there on the ground, soaked in sweat, lifting crates of fish with local volunteers. It was a surreal sight. Soldiers standing watch not for war, but to protect tilapia. For people like Mariam, a 63-year-old grandmother raising 4 grandchildren after her son was killed by militants, the meaning was clear. He gave us food. No one else came, but he did. Burkina Faso is under siege, not just by extremist groups, but by hunger, drought, and decades of neglect. In a country where over 2 million people are internally displaced and nearly half the population faces food insecurity, dropping fish into rivers may sound odd. But to the villagers along the Volta River, it was hope. Tangible, immediate, alive. Why would a president prioritize fish over bullets? Why choose nets over rifles? In this story, we'll explore how a single act, releasing 200 tons of fish, became a national strategy, a moral message, and perhaps a symbol of a new kind of African leadership. If this image of a child smiling beside a river full of fish made you pause, stay with us. You're about to witness a story the news won't tell you. If you believe that strength can look like compassion and that leadership begins with feeding the hungry, then this is a story you won't forget. It began with an order, not for weapons, not for soldiers, but for fish, 200 tons of live fish to be exact. In a country where food shortages and armed conflict dominate daily life, President Ibrahim Traoré made a decision few leaders would dare to consider. He launched a nationwide program to restock rivers, lakes, and reservoirs with fish, aiming to revive food supply chains that had collapsed under pressure from war and drought. The operation was logistically complex. Dozens of military trucks, normally used to transport ammunition, were retrofitted with oxygenated tanks. The fish, primarily tilapia and catfish, were bred in special government-supported hatcheries and transported under heavy guard to areas deemed secure enough for release. Over 10 provinces received shipments, with priority given to regions hardest hit by conflict and famine. To many outside observers, the move seemed symbolic at best, eccentric at worst. But inside Burkina Faso, the logic was crystal clear. Armed groups had for years used hunger as a weapon, cutting off food routes, burning farms, and controlling access to water. In rural provinces like Soum, villagers couldn't farm or fish without risking their lives. The rivers, once full of life, had turned into ghost streams. Traoré's strategy was simple. Give people back their rivers, and you give them back their power. One such river runs near the village of Arbinda, where an aging fisherman named Idrissa had abandoned his nets years ago. There was no point, he said. No fish, no peace, just fear. When the military returned this year, not to raid or recruit, but to deliver fish, Idrissa cried, "I never thought I'd see our waters come alive again." Today, he's back on his boat, teaching his grandsons how to cast a net. This was not just a food security operation, it was a reclamation of sovereignty. By focusing on fish, Traoré did more than feed people. He disrupted a strategy of starvation that had been working against the state for years. For the militants, food scarcity had been a tool. For Traoré, fish became resistance. Moreover, the impact was immediate. Within weeks of the fish being released, satellite data showed increased activity along riverbanks. Villages that had emptied out began to repopulate. Informal fish markets reopened. In the northern region of Kaya, local radio stations began broadcasting fishing tips alongside security updates. One station even launched a daily program called Hope from the River, where callers shared their catches of the day. The numbers tell a powerful story. According to the Ministry of Agriculture, local protein consumption in the pilot zones rose by 28% in just 2 months. School attendance in river-adjacent communities increased, particularly among young boys who were often pulled into militia groups when schools closed. Families that once relied on foreign food aid were now supplementing their own diets, proudly, independently, and locally. But there was more to the story. In regions like Nagna and Udalan, the fish releases were accompanied by mobile health clinics and seed distribution programs. It wasn't just about fish. It was about restoring a sense of normal life. Traoré wasn't just stocking rivers. He was restocking hope. Yet, critics remain. Some in the urban elite dismissed the program as folkloric politics. International observers warned that fish cannot defend against RPGs or drones. And while that may be true, the deeper reality is this: no army can function on an empty stomach. No community can resist radicalization when its children are hungry. For Traoré, the fish were just the beginning of a larger strategy: to rebuild Burkina Faso from the ground up, starting with the most basic human need: food. His philosophy, often stated in speeches, is simple. Where there is food, there is dignity. Where there is dignity, there is peace. The symbolic power of the initiative also shouldn't be underestimated. Across West Africa, people took notice. Social media in Mali, Niger, and even Senegal lit up with images of the Burkina fish drop. Hashtags like fish not guns and feed to free began trending locally. For a continent often portrayed as dependent and broken, Traoré's fish became a symbol of defiance and vision. But not all reactions were positive. Regional extremist groups reportedly saw the fish drops as threats to their control and issued warnings against participating. In the province of Yaga, one volunteer fisherman was attacked days after receiving his first boatload of catch. The message was clear: hope, too, can be dangerous. And still, the operation continues. Burkina Faso is a nation on the edge, and this bold program may very well tip the balance. But in which direction? Can rivers full of fish hold back rivers of blood? Can dignity defeat drones? These are not simple questions. But Traoré has placed his bet. He has chosen life. The question now is, what made him do it? What turning point pushed a soldier to become a shepherd of his people, rather than a warlord in uniform? That answer lies in a moment few people saw, a moment that changed everything. But what exactly sparked this turning point? And why did Traoré defy the logic of war in favor of water? The turning point came not in a government hall or military base, but on a wooden raft in the middle of a river. Cameras rolled as President Ibrahim Traoré stepped barefoot onto the raft, surrounded by local fishermen, and threw the first crate of fish into the water with his own hands. The crowd along the riverbank erupted, not in applause, but in raw emotion. Some cheered. Others cried. A few knelt in prayer. It wasn't just about fish anymore. It was about something sacred being restored. The video of that moment went viral within hours. Local networks replayed it every hour. By evening, regional media dubbed it the day the river came back to life. But the emotional peak didn't stop at the water's edge. In the capital, Ouagadougou, thousands gathered in front of the National Palace, chanting, "Traoré is with us, not above us." It was spontaneous, peaceful, and deeply symbolic. In a country used to marching against governments, the people had finally gathered to march with one. For many, this was the first time they had seen a leader stand in the mud, shoulder to shoulder with the poor. No suit, no motorcade, no script, just a man, his people, and a shared struggle. That image struck a chord, not just across Burkina Faso, but across the continent. In Ghana, a radio host called it one of the most honest moments in modern African leadership. In Nigeria, social media flooded with comparisons to past leaders who had ruled from ivory towers. One story in particular spread quickly. It was about 13-year-old Abu Bakar, an orphan from the town of Barcelogo. His parents had been killed in a raid by militants, and he had survived by eating scraps and fishing with makeshift hooks. When Traoré visited the town's dried-up lake, he saw the boy holding a small tin can tied to string. Moved, the president gave him a new fishing rod and told him, "Someday, you'll teach others." The moment was captured on video. Abubakar's eyes lit up with something the country hadn't seen in years: hope. But the reactions weren't all emotional. The business community began to take note. Local cooperatives organized quickly. Women's associations in the northern regions formed fish drying and smoking collectives. For the first time in over a decade, a coordinated grassroots economy began to emerge. Not from top-down programs, but from a bottom-up wave of initiative triggered by the government's action. Still, the most surprising response came from within the military. Officers, many of whom had been hardened by years of counterinsurgency, found new meaning in their deployment. Instead of simply guarding villages, they now helped distribute supplies, protected fishing zones, and even assisted with setting up mobile markets. In one case, a battalion from the eastern region built a temporary cold storage facility to help preserve catch for distant communities. A colonel was quoted saying, "We are no longer just defenders. We are rebuilders." International observers began to pay closer attention. The African Union sent a delegation to investigate the project. Several Sahelian nations in crisis requested reports on how the program was implemented. Even humanitarian NGOs, long critical of military regimes, issued cautious praise. One European aid worker said off the record, "This is the first time in a long while where we're not needed." And that's a good thing. Still, not everyone celebrated. Extremist groups saw the rising stability as a threat. In areas where the fish program succeeded, they lost control. Markets reopened. Schools resumed. Militias began to lose their grip. In retaliation, several attacks were launched against villages involved in the program. In one tragic case, a community leader in Yatenga was abducted after publicly thanking the government. His fate remains unknown. The stakes were raised. The fish were no longer just a source of food. They were now a front in a silent war between two visions of Burkina Faso, one of despair and domination, the other of dignity and determination. This is where the emotional high turned into a national test. At a press conference days after the first wave of attacks, Traoré stood solemnly in front of a packed room. He did not offer empty promises or retaliation. Instead, he told the nation, "If they destroy our markets, we will rebuild them. If they poison our rivers, we will clean them. If they take one of us, 10 more will rise. We do not kneel to fear. We stand in faith." The room was silent. Then it erupted. His words echoed far beyond the walls of the presidential compound. They became slogans, painted on walls and whispered in homes. For the people of Burkina Faso, this was no longer just a fish program. It was a movement. But for all the unity and pride, questions lingered. The insurgents were not gone. The infrastructure remained fragile. And the international community, especially the United States, had yet to speak. Would this grassroots momentum be enough, or would the old forces of instability rise again? Burkina Faso had chosen its path, but it would not walk it alone. The world was watching. And now the pressure was shifting. Would the international community, especially the West, act in time to support this fragile resurgence? Or would silence once again become complicity? As rivers filled with fish and marketplaces reopened, the streets of Burkina Faso began to breathe again. But under the surface of this newfound energy was a fragile balance, one teetering between renewal and relapse. The fish program had ignited a wave of civic optimism, but it also stirred powerful undercurrents in the political and social fabric of the nation. In the town of Djibo, where gunfire once echoed daily, a different kind of sound now rang through the air. The shouts of children at school and the chatter of mothers selling smoked fish at makeshift stalls. According to the Ministry of Social Affairs, school attendance in these zones rose by over 30% in just 3 months. For many families, it wasn't just about nutrition. It was about stability. A steady income from fishing meant children could stay in school instead of working or joining armed groups. But not every family was whole. In the central region of San Matenga, Awa, a 39-year-old widow shared her story. Her husband, a local teacher, had been taken by insurgents over a year ago. With 4 children and no stable income, she relied on humanitarian food rations to survive. When the fish program arrived, she hesitated. "I thought it was a trap," she said. "We've seen so many promises broken." But then, a neighbor taught her how to clean and dry fish. Today, she manages a small table at the village market and sends her 2 oldest children back to school. "I'm not rich," she said, "but we're not begging anymore." These personal recoveries reflect a broader shift. In rural areas, fish became a form of currency, traded for vegetables, soap, even school books. The informal economy surged. Women's groups organized into cooperatives. Young men who once saw no future beyond a rifle now found pride in providing for their families with a fishing net. Yet, for all the civilian hope, the political class faced turbulence. The old guard, politicians tied to foreign aid networks and extractive industries, saw their influence wane. Traoré's grassroots popularity eclipsed theirs. His refusal to return to conventional donor-driven programs upset Western-oriented elites in the capital. Parliamentarians, once allied with French-backed development plans, now found themselves out of touch with the public mood. In an emergency session of the National Assembly, opposition members accused the president of populist theatrics. They questioned the sustainability of the fish program and warned of inflation in local markets. But their criticisms rang hollow. In a televised broadcast, a group of women from the southern city of Bobo Dioulasso responded, "If feeding your people is a performance, then may he never leave the stage." Militarily, the shift was even more striking. Security forces reported a 25% drop in insurgent attacks in zones surrounding the river restocking areas. Analysts believe this was due in part to the reoccupation of riverbanks by civilians, effectively creating human shields against militant operations. The more people returned to the rivers, the harder it became for extremists to move unnoticed. But it was not just insurgents who felt threatened. Foreign corporations with interests in land, water rights, and natural resources began to raise quiet objections. In particular, mining concessions near protected waters suddenly found themselves under new scrutiny. In the past, such companies had operated with little resistance. But with Traoré's emphasis on food sovereignty and environmental restoration, new regulations emerged. Several permits were suspended. One European mining CEO was reportedly told, "If you pollute our water, you'll answer to our mothers, not just our courts." The message was clear. Burkina Faso was reclaiming its agency. Still, the transition was far from smooth. Tensions flared between local authorities and central ministries over resource distribution. Some mayors complained of unequal access to the fish deliveries. Others accused regional commanders of favoritism. In the east, violent clashes broke out between 2 villages over river access rights, resulting in 3 deaths. The government quickly dispatched mediators, but the incident revealed the challenges of rapid decentralization. And then there was the diaspora. Burkinabe communities abroad, many of whom had fled during years of conflict, watched these developments with mixed emotions. Some were inspired and began sending remittances back home specifically to support local cooperatives. Others remained skeptical, citing a lack of long-term infrastructure. The United Nations issued a cautious statement praising the program's early impact, but urging transparency and oversight. Meanwhile, the African Development Bank began quietly exploring funding mechanisms to scale similar projects in other Sahel countries. Domestically, however, one truth became increasingly apparent. The people were no longer passive. They were mobilized, not by ideology or foreign agendas, but by the rediscovery of self-sufficiency. In a recent public poll conducted by a regional university, over 60% of respondents said they believed the government was now more connected to everyday struggles than at any point in the last decade. And yet, Even as these civil gains solidified, a sense of uncertainty remained. Burkina Faso had taken a bold step, but steps forward often invite pushback. With the rise of internal pride came increased external scrutiny. With the revival of riverbanks came new border tensions over water rights. With grassroots power came the inevitable question of global power dynamics. And now, as the people rise, eyes turn toward Washington. Will the United States respond with support, skepticism, or silence? In Washington, the images of President Ibrahim Traoré throwing crates of fish into a muddy river triggered more confusion than clarity. At the Pentagon, analysts watched the footage with raised eyebrows. At the State Department, policy aides debated whether the move signaled pragmatism or populism. And at major think tanks, the question arose, is this simply symbolic? Or is Burkina Faso crafting a new model of post-Western governance? For decades, American involvement in the Sahel has followed a predictable formula: security cooperation, counter-terrorism training, and aid packages often filtered through global NGOs. But Traoré's fish diplomacy didn't fit the model. It was hyper-local. It was fast. It didn't wait for multilateral approval. And most importantly, it worked, at least in the short term. The U.S. response was measured. A spokesperson from the National Security Council acknowledged the initiative, calling it an innovative approach to community stabilization, but stopped short of endorsing it. Behind closed doors, there were deeper concerns. Some defense officials feared that programs like Traoré's might reduce American leverage in the region. Others worried that a success story without Western fingerprints could inspire similar movements in Mali, Niger, or beyond, nations where American influence is already eroding. Meanwhile, in Europe, reactions were more pointed. French media outlets, once dominant in shaping the narrative around West Africa, were noticeably critical. One editorial in Le Monde described the fish campaign as a distraction from deeper structural issues. German and Belgian officials expressed quiet frustration over losing ground in a region long considered under European strategic oversight. But not all global responses were skeptical. In Brazil, the Minister of Social Development cited the Burkina Faso program as a model for localized food security. In India, agricultural innovation forums began tracking the story. And across the African Union, Traoré's name surfaced more frequently in closed-door meetings as a rising voice challenging the old paradigm. Still, for American viewers and policymakers, one question looms larger than all others. What does this mean for U.S. national security? The answer lies in geography. The Sahel is no longer a peripheral concern. With increasing migration pressures, rising jihadist networks, and strategic mineral reserves, instability in countries like Burkina Faso can quickly ripple across continents. For years, U.S. strategy has been reactive, responding to threats after they emerge. Traoré's approach, by contrast, is proactive, addressing root causes before they metastasize. Some American veterans of African affairs quietly applauded the initiative. One retired diplomat commented, "This is the first time I've seen someone tackle terrorism with a fishing net instead of a drone. Maybe it's time we listen." That kind of humility is rare in foreign policy circles. But the truth is becoming harder to ignore. Something new is happening in Burkina Faso, and the world's superpowers have yet to decide whether they'll embrace it, compete with it, or try to shut it down. But as the world hesitates, the situation on the ground is shifting fast. Could this be the beginning of a much larger crisis, or a rebirth? The rivers of Burkina Faso are no longer just waterways. They've become front lines, dividing not only land and insurgents, but old paradigms from new hopes. What began with a few hundred tons of fish may now shape the fate of an entire region. And as the winds shift across the Sahel, so too does the fragile balance between peace and collapse. The danger is real. Extremist groups have not vanished. Food security is not guaranteed. If regional neighbors fail to respond, or worse, if foreign actors try to destabilize what they cannot control, this moment of rebirth could be lost. And if that happens, the consequences will not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. Mali, Niger, Chad, they are all watching. So is Russia. So is China. And yes, so is America. The question remains, is Ibrahim Traoré a passing phenomenon or a sign of a deeper movement? One rooted in dignity, not dependency. Can a man with limited resources but unlimited resolve truly reshape the arc of African governance? Or will global power structures grind his vision into the dust? This is not just about geopolitics. It is about fathers feeding their children, about widows finding purpose again, about villages once silenced by fear, now waking up to the sound of oars hitting water. And if we are honest with ourselves, it is also about us, the world watching from afar. What will we do? Will we support peace that does not bear our signature? Will we recognize leadership born not from elite institutions, but from muddy riverbanks? Because if we don't, if silence wins again, then the cost won't just be paid in Africa. It will come to our shores too, as waves of displacement, instability, and broken alliances. But if we act with courage, with humility, with faith, perhaps this time will be different. If this story moved something inside you, don't let it end here. Speak about it. Pray about it. Share it with someone who still believes in human dignity. If you've ever hoped for a world where strength and compassion walk side by side, then keep watching this channel. We will keep bringing you voices from the margins, where the real battles for justice are being fought. And if you believe, like we do, that Africa deserves more than pity or profit, that it deserves partners, then stay close. This is only the beginning. May God bless the people of Burkina Faso. May He bless every hand that casts a net in faith, every mother who feeds her child with courage, and every leader who dares to stand alone for what is right.